believe in one of your lectures, you say that the ego is a sort of ethical challenge. And we hear about ethics all of the time when we're reading Lacan. There's an entire seminar, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. But I feel like, at least maybe not on YouTube, there aren't that many available explorations of what ethics means in this context. And I take it it's not the everyday usage of the word that we're dealing with. So, my first question is very broad. How do you feel Lacan defines, well, this ethic, I guess, better than ethics? And how do you think his attitude towards the ethic or ethics of psychoanalysis might have changed throughout his career?
So maybe just to like, I mentioned this little piece earlier on, but just I know you know where I'm coming from, but like maybe other people wouldn't get it. So the reason I use that phrase is just to say that I think the way one, but when I'm saying that what starts to feel like it is apparent in seminar one is that the ego provides us with an ethical challenge. Maybe I'm trying to be a bit paradoxical, but I suppose what I mean is that if, to recapitulate some of what we said in the earlier part of this conversation, if the analyst's task is not to situate themselves with their ego, and is certainly not to be the imaginary other, the mirror image, the person who models. You sometimes hear this in psychology and clinical psychology settings. Clinicians or training clinicians will say, "Oh, well, I try to model this behavior," and I'm like, "What?" That's completely not what Lacan wants. So to talk about, maybe to rephrase it and say that the fact of an ego, be it the analysand's ego, or for that matter, the clinician's own ego, provides us with a real, pretty massive challenge. We don't necessarily have to call that ethical, but I would call that an ethical challenge of how to be committed to doing psychoanalytic work, to being committed to hearing the unconscious, to being committed to facilitating the desire of the subject. Those degrees of fidelity to psychoanalysis itself are tasks that require not being fundamentally present as an imaginary other, as an ego for the analyst, and also in an odd sort of way start to mean that one doesn't have a fidelity to the ego of the analysand. And that follows if one buys the notion that the ego is essentially imaginary, or that the ego is precisely the thing that one's trying to deconstruct. So just to give that provisional little precursory set of comments about how I understand that. And now that I've said it, it kind of, I stand by that. Like how one would need to locate oneself as a Lacanian in the clinic is weirdly not to hear, well, yeah, I mean, it sounds odd to say it, but this is the Lacanian thing, is not to try to track the meaning of the ego. It's to hear something other than the ego. It's to facilitate the subject, not the ego. And that's what I mean by the ethics thing there. What does Lacan mean by ethics, and what starts to happen in seminar 7? I got like a Derek summary version of that, which may or may not be quite right. But one move one could make there is to say that how certain traditional ethical formulas and formulations seem to unfold is in a way that suggests that ethics might be something which is about being, for example, good to another. And that remains within a kind of imaginary domain of ethics. And interestingly, also, the idea of being good to another is also something that Lacan rails against. Like if one wants to be an analyst in order to do good for another, it's a recipe for destruction, because I want to do good for someone. What happens if they don't cooperate and have the good done to them, right? What if they don't want that? Then one might find that the analyst or the psychotherapist figure who's so intent on doing good and helping others starts to build up quite a degree of resentment, even hatred for the person who's not cooperating with the good that they're trying to do to them, right? So this kind of ethics, which is anchored we won't name it because I don't want to get myself into philosophical conundrums and problems about misrepresenting a school. But an ethics which seems to be anchored on doing good for the other is not going to work in Lacanian theory. Or put differently, it's an ethics which maybe is able to do a certain task, but it's not able to do the task of psychoanalysis. Any ethics that pivots on doing good for the other. Then we could say that there's other forms of ethics that try to do good in terms of the symbolic, try to do a good thing. And of course, one of the Lacanian critiques there would be, well, like, who's the recipient of who is ultimately benefited from doing this thing? And if there's an egoic dimension that is retained in trying to have done a good thing, then once again, that sounds a little bit, too egoic, too imaginary for an ethics of psychoanalysis. And that's also, just bear in mind that when Lacan is talking about the ethics of psychoanalysis, I think he means just that. I don't think this is supposed to be an ethics for outside the clinic. I think it's supposed to be an ethics for the clinic itself. And if that's the case, then part of that ethics should entail an ethics of desire. And an ethics of desire means what? Well, lots of things, but one of the things that an ethics of desire would entail would be listening to desire. And things get important. There's an important qualification to make here because, inevitably we're going to bump up against the only thing that the subject can be guilty of is giving ground on matters of their desire. And what does that mean? But let me say one of the things that it doesn't mean. One of the things that doesn't mean is that the subject should simply do what they want and have what they want at all times. Now, we can immediately problematize that, actually, because if you've got a neurotic subject who's fundamentally characterized by inhibition and guilt and aversion to what they want, then maybe that formula just dismissed might be quite helpful to ask, to enable within the clinical environment. You just did this funny prevarication. What do you want? I mean, and you could say this is a kind of big question of psychoanalysis. What is it that you want? But to maybe, I know we're summing up now, one way of thinking about it then is certainly around era of Seminar 7, the psychoanalytic ethics would want to differentiate itself from various other types of good, a symbolic good, an ethical good premised on an ego, and would be rather something akin to an ethics of desire. And one of the dimensions to the ethics of desire within the clinic would be to relentlessly pursue and listen to and wants, desires, and not wants and desires that, oh, I want this and now I want to have it, but a fidelity to desire. That's another way of putting it. And to build on upon that, to be a fidelity to desire as an empty form. And that's crucial, because I do remember someone wanting to do this reading, a colleague of mine from years ago, that, well, it's always about what the subject wants and just getting rid of their inhibitions and going for what they want. As I've just said, if there are obstructive inhibitions and a great deal of that within the neurotic field of that subject, yes, there could be some good in trying to do that. But ultimately, that's not going to be enough, because that's going to confuse demand for desire. Desire and fidelity to desire will always mean, in Lacanian theory, fidelity to desire is an empty form, because desire is no longer desire when it's been stagnates to an object of demand, right? Desire by definition is constantly unfulfilled. And when the thing that was my object petit, invested with my object petit A, is owned, possessed, then desire is going to be elsewhere. It's not going to be in that thing anymore. So yeah, let me say that by conclusion then. One way of approaching the multiple different trajectories and ideas that get thrown about in Seminar 7, and there's a whole bunch, obviously there's jouissance, there's das Ding, there's all of that. The idea of fidelity to desire is, and desire as an empty form, by which one means that it's always the thing that migrates away from the thing you wanted and then you got. That idea is a kind of an ethics of psychoanalysis. And I think we can hear it both at a kind of meta level in the way I've been speaking, but also at the level of a fidelity to listening to desire as it emerges in the slippages, in the interruptions, in the evasions, in the inhibitions of a neurotic subject. So fidelity to the psychoanalytic process of tracking, of hearing desire, and thereby also facilitating speech, and being aware that the subject may constantly avoid their desire. And if we think about the clinic of neurosis, we're confronting those two conundrums, those two impossibilities: the obsessional's desire for an impossible desire, and the hysteric's desire for a desire to remain unfulfilled. But one nevertheless wants to hear the desire in language, or the desire that is made manifest via language, even if that seems in many instances an impossible task. So that's one clinical way of trying to apply that formula, but it's also at a more substantive level, if we can put it that way, or more philosophical level, the pursuit of what it means to have a fidelity to the desire that is the necessary corollary of one's own lack, and which remains unfulfillable because its desire is an empty form of desire. That's one way of thinking. In quite abstract terms, I think the ethics of psychoanalysis, certainly for Lacan of Seminar 7.